Hey friends, and welcome back to the series of What Do You Do? Now if you guys are new here, this series is going to be all about the full interviews that I've had with all the job roles that I'm covering. So if you haven't seen it already, make sure you go back and check out the summary videos before checking out this whole full interview. But if you guys have already seen it, then make sure you just keep watching. I hope you guys enjoy. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Ben, and today we're going to be going over the role of a service designer. So I've got a very good friend of mine here and a very great mentor of mine throughout all of IBM here, Joe. For everyone who's watching, would you mind giving them a quick introduction in terms of, what you do and how long you've been in the role?
Sure, yeah. Hey Ben. So I am a service designer by trade. IBM actually refers to my role more broadly as business design. That's something we can touch on a little bit through this chat. I've been in the role for maybe 5-6 years. And your role kind of changes as you get more senior and progress in a company like IBM. You kind of start as a pure practitioner and you kind of make your way more towards building a practice and a business. But probably 6 years. Feeling like I'm at a precipice now where I'm like, I've stopped being a practitioner and I'm sort of more on the like commercial side, which has been an interesting change.
Awesome. And you're saying business design, right? So as well. So for, I guess, everyone watching, how would you break it down for them in terms of, because I've seen in the other videos talked about UX, UI design, and there was a slight mention in terms of service design and how they're kind of like interrelated. So how would you sort of differentiate in terms of what, I guess, service design is or business design is?
It's become a bit of a buzzword in the industry, if I'm honest, particularly in the last like 2 to 3 years. I always think the easiest way of thinking about it is, so everyone kind of understands customer experience and user experience as a thing. And that way of thinking and way of working has kind of been driving industry in the last kind of 5 to 10 years. If you kind of want to take the generic example, it's the Steve Jobs Apple thing, right? They kind of changed how we look at business to a degree. And offshoots of that has been a whole range of design skills. I think maybe if you go back 10, 15 years, design was more kind of like your graphic designers, right? People that were kind of very focused on pixel perfect, poster art or maybe some small subset doing the UI, like software UI and stuff, but it wasn't really heavily focused on. So if you think about customer experience and user experience as human-centered design, so understanding the customer journey, what those customer touch points are, what pleases and displeases that customer, and trying to enhance that experience over end to end or over time. Really broadly, that would kind of be customer experience and user experience. Where service design comes in as a specific skill set is kind of the intersection between people. So not always the user, right? Sometimes we work on things that are employee focused, which in that instance would be the user. But when people think of customer experience, they think of end customer. It's not always the case. So it's the intersection between people, technology, and process or business. So maybe an easy example would be when you think about a customer journey or you design a future-facing customer journey, you have to be able to implement that journey. So when a user downloads an app and taps login or taps something on that app, and you've designed that experience, a whole load of stuff happens under the hood to make sure that's super smooth. And maybe the load time's a few seconds, and it has to ping and store your information in a database somewhere. And then people in the business need that information shared for other reasons, right? So all these interactions between what the user's doing, what the technology is doing, and how the business is using that information is kind of where a service designer plays, and holistically designing that solution. So they work quite closely with user experience designers, or people would call that role different things, but yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely, before joining IBM, I thought like design was literally what you're saying, right? Like how it looks and the pixels and stuff, but like I never really thought of it as customer as well, and like more user based, right? Like user experience based. So this whole time I was like, oh yeah, like design is not for me. Like it's not something I do until I came into this like in consulting, and then it's like, okay, I kind of can see how this is going and how it's transforming, right, and changing completely. And that connection, I guess, between people, technology, and processes, right? And then a general definition of what people is like it's very different, right? Like it could relate to anyone, right? So in terms of, like you were saying, doesn't always have to be the actual user of an application. It could be the employee as well, whoever created it, right? Created that experience.
We sometimes do. You'll know this, Ben, but we sometimes do a lot of work for government in IBM. And when we generalize customer experience or user experience working for government, it can mean citizen, i.e. like us, like accessing kind of like benefits or whatever that might be. but it also can mean like the employees or the agents that are dealing with the citizens. There's loads of layers of who these users are, and you kind of bucket them in the same thing, right? As customer.
Yeah. Exactly. And then so one thing that as someone who wants to sort of get into this role, right? So I'd be keen to hear, I guess, your background first, and then whether that was even relevant to service design. Because, for example, in my position, I did engineering and commerce, right? But now, like, I'm in tech, and people get that question, goes, hey, how are they related? Was it even relevant? What was sort of your background in coming into this?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think also what I might do is make a distinction between business design as well, because I think that would also make more sense in the context of my background.
Yep.
So what I would do with just to distinguish the two, so service design being the intersection of people, process, and technology. You can think of like service designers working on either products, like a product or a service, taking a problem, coming up with a solution, and ideally launching that solution. That would kind of be where the service designer plays. Again, super generalizing. Where business design is slightly different is business design integrates kind of what would be typical management consulting skill sets, but uses a design method to achieve the same outcomes. So if you think about the kind of McKinsey's, BCGs, those kind of companies that do that real traditional management consulting, advising on cost out or macro trends or big digital strategies and platforms that they should be using, right? All that sort of work. Business designers do that same work, but they apply a human-centered method, a design method. So typically you'll get people who do business design and can also be a service designer, or you'll get service designers, pure, who can do a little bit of business design. I always think of these things as kind of like a continuum, right? Like all the way down the bottom end, bottom end, that's not the right way of saying it. that all the way down the left end, you have kind of UI design, like pixel perfect pushing design. And then maybe as you progress upwards, you have UX design, which is kind of still working on UI and some builds in some more journey focus and starts to blend into service design. And then you've got kind of service design. Service designers typically aren't very good at the UI design stuff, right? You do get some unicorns that can do it all, but if we're generalizing, and then you move from service design up into the kind of strategic space, which is sort of business design. And that would kind of be different companies use different names, but really they're the skill sets that kind of, my background, why I kind of went on that spiel is that I play kind of in the business and service design space. That's sort of like what I've always done. My background actually is in economics and econometrics. Which is
not design.
Maths, right? Yeah, it's not design. It's maths, and it's statistical economics. That was what I did my undergrad in. I then kind of came straight out of uni and actually spent a bit of time in some different investment banking and finance-based roles. So kind of equity trading, fixed income stuff, right? That's probably a whole nother chat, but you do learn a lot of skills in that way of thinking, particularly on the math side, right? Understanding and being able to model things, right? Is a pretty cool skill you learn from that when it comes to the McKinsey style management consulting, right? So I guess the right angle into the design space was that kind of management consulting type skill set. And also I guess my industry knowledge on finance, because Ben, this is probably another thing we could talk about, but IBM kind of assigns us by industry verticals, which I think is quite common for big companies. You sort of specialize in an industry. So do I think my background was relevant to my current job? No, not really. Did I need my economics degree to get my role? Not at all. But it kind of was a way that opened the door and gave me a lot of opportunity to choose where I did land. I don't think I'd have been able to get a UX role. But coming in as more of a, I guess before design was really buzzy, making me sound old, but sort of 6 years ago, I was kind of brought in as a strategy consultant, right? I guess that was my route. It was kind of a strong degree going into a strategic role. That was kind of the route in. But yeah, no, I didn't need my degree, in short.
I guess so if you went down that path, right? So you're doing investment banking and financing. How did you suddenly go, okay, I want to do consulting?
Oh man, there's so many different ways I can answer the question. Like if I'm being honest, like one of the real motivations was I really didn't enjoy the finance space. It wasn't too long after the GFC that I was trying to look for roles in that kind of sphere, in that world. The working environment wasn't very nice. The opportunities were pretty few and far between, right? So I kind of, especially as your first working experience, right, came out and I was a bit like, nah, I'm not sure about that. Like I said, the strategic consulting route was, I guess, is quite a typical. So if you think about the big before, it's quite common for people to move out of banking or investment banking and stuff into management consulting. That's a pretty well-trodden path. And as a grad that didn't really know what the kind of future held for me, I kind of thought, well, let me go try that out, right?
Give it a crack.
Yeah, and I applied for a bunch of stuff. I actually have a really big personal interest in technology, and I think we'll touch on some of this stuff later on. So I had way more interest in joining and being a strategic consultant within technology than I did kind of doing it from a more traditional sense. So I ended up applying for companies like IBM for that reason. So really, I guess it was a slow process of taking my core skill set of problem solving and strategic thinking, meeting some really amazing people in the design world and learning from them, and slowly kind of merging those two paths, I'd say.
I guess that was similar to how I got into IBM, right? Like I had a engineering, like mechanical engineering as well background, and then finance, and then like it was just more the interest in technology, right, that got me to go, okay, let me just look at tech companies, and then I'm going to apply for those sort of roles in those companies, and then realizing, oh, like design or like consulting, and just suddenly goes, oh, okay, this is massive. Like I guess I got lucky. I joined when it was a bit more well established. So I got to learn from, like, for example, you, right? Like, so you had all this experience and knowledge from other people, and then I was able to learn from that, which I guess really helped in terms of my career, in terms of understanding what design is, and the three different roles and 4 different roles that you were mentioning earlier in terms of design. If I'm someone who wants to get into service or business design, right? A lot of times when we're deciding on a job, we're always cautious of like, okay, what sort of responsibilities, what sort of activities we're going to do? Like, an actual day in the life of a service designer, right? Or business design. Like, is it as some jobs are like, okay, it's really repetitive. It's the same thing. I just go in and out. Like I have meetings every single day and I just do the same thing over and over again. Like consulting is a bit different, but like realistically, if you were to give what your general activities or tasks are in a day of a service designer, what would that sort of look like?
If I talk specifically about if you're a service designer working on a service design gig, there's maybe 2 different paths you can take. Again, there's loads of different paths, but if we're being super general, there's 2 different paths, and you can kind of go down the consulting route, or you can kind of go down the in-house, I guess you'd call it, or product route. What I mean by that is working for a company that has a product or a service or something and helping them in the capacity of a service designer. I think your day-to-day would look really similar. The only reason I make the distinction is like Ben and I have gone the consulting path. And so it means that every time we work on a project, it's a whole different problem and a whole different solution. And I'm sure I speak for both of us, Ben, like I love that, right? I love it being a completely different problem every time and having to like resolve stuff. That's awesome. But similarly, the other route, you'd get really deep expertise in your product space, right? And you'd probably become an expert in whatever it is you're designing, and you'd be able to see real tangible change over time and make real impact. And both are really, really good routes. Day to day, if I really make it simple, it kind of depends on the phase of the life cycle of design. So if you think about like the beginning of the life cycle being you've come up with an idea or there's a problem you have to solve. And if you think of the end of the life cycle being, well, there shouldn't be an end of the life cycle actually. So I'll catch myself up there, right? But we'll call it the end of the life cycle to make it simple. Is you have a launched product in market. It's really mature. You've got loads of people using it. You're capturing feedback from them, making little changes and pushing little changes out, kind of like how in the App Store you get an update and it's it just says bug fixes and you don't really know what it's doing, right? That's kind of the end of the life cycle. What you're doing is very different depending on what stage of the process you're in. But maybe the most typical one to talk about is up front, because that's typically where a service designer gets most involved. If I'm honest, most of your early stage or most of your day is actually in, I'm going to generalize it as like learning, right? So you are spending loads of times in workshops, like running design thinking workshops, engaging with subject matter experts, different parts of the business, be it the business domain experts or the technology experts or the users themselves, right? If you can get access to the users, that's like perfect. So that, and you're basically trying to learn and understand what happens today. That's like the most important thing that you're doing at the beginning. And I reckon, weighting wise, Ben, I'd say 90% of your time is spent learning. I'm going to call it generally, I'm going to call it learning. Now, in terms of practical elements, you're running workshops, you're planning workshops, you're tidying up and deciphering notes that you've taken, and you're quite often translating these things into assets that are more useful to the user, to the company, right? So we can talk about certain design assets like service blueprints and personas. And I think anyone listening to this would be semi-familiar with these words, but you're typically doing that sort of stuff. I think the second general activity I'd say is like you are kind of like forward planning. So as well as like trying to understand today, you're also looking at what else you need to either further that understanding or to be able to progress to ideation, or to maybe remove some internal problems in the business around the technology you need to use. Like you might want to go and explore some platforms that you can use to solve some of the problems. So there's kind of that forward planning element. And I'd say the third element is kind of like analysis really broadly. You're trying to understand what you have and make sense of what you have. Like really the service designer's job is to take all the ambiguity and take all the everything and distill it into like the most pertinent and most important bits of information, and then decide what to do with those bits of information. And that problem solving element is like super important. Yeah.
It reminds me, because I remember we've been on projects together, and one of the major projects that we had recently was like literally learning engineering, right? And it was a bit easier for me because I had engineering. Yeah, it was easier for me because I had an engineering background, but for you as well. Like it was like you didn't have that engineering background, right? But like you had that maths background, so that whole problem solving, and we literally had to learn a whole different domain, industry expertise over a span of like 2 weeks or less. So a lot of it is, again, from our side, exactly right. If you categorize it as learning, but the actual activities is like, workshops, a lot of reading and researching that comes along with it. I guess it speeds up if we do get that user interaction as well. So if you're able to speak to them directly, or the client, and interview them, it makes it so much easier compared to if we just had to read on a piece of paper.
Yeah, I mean, just in the sense of completeness, right? Like I said, it depends on where you are in the life cycle. But if I was to rattle off some typical things a service designer might do, right? You're doing user research. If I generalize it, you might be doing prototyping, right? Again, depending on what your skill set is and who's in your team, you typically are prototyping solutions. You quite often will be doing some sort of data work, whether that's just mapping data flows, or maybe you're actually analyzing data sets, or it kind of depends on the problem, but you're doing some sort of data work. You are pretty much always doing process work, right? You're looking at today's process and improving tomorrow's process, right? And there's loads of different ways people attack that. Some people would refer to that entirely as customer journey work, which is true in some instances, but if you think about the layer under a customer journey, there's typically always a process that supports it. So kind of parallel work, you're typically doing all of that. And as you get nearer to development, you're also then kind of like, if you think about real typical agile work, you're defining your, let's use really general language, you're defining your epics, and you're helping write your user stories and acceptance criteria, almost functioning as a bit of a business analyst. Because you've taken the idea through design, you probably know the most about the solution, right? So you're kind of supporting the team in those kind of more product focused elements, I'd say. We can talk about end of life cycle, but I think that gives a flavor. Yeah,
I think it's probably a whole nother episode or video about agile as well, like all the epics and all those, right, like features. So it's probably a whole nother thing.
Bored people. Yeah.
I guess you were mentioning, right, like as a service designer, if we generalize, right, like we don't really do too much UX or UI design work. But in your case, would you say that you do that? And I guess how did you get that experience into getting into there? Because you were saying it's quite different in terms of this end of the spectrum compared to this end of the spectrum, if you talk about it that way.
I have done in the past, if I'm honest with you. Like when I first started out, I was doing a lot more of the more typical UX elements. A service designer needs to know intimately UX, right? A service designer needs to know and understand how UX works, what their method and process is. You need to know and understand it intimately. Whether you yourself end up, downloading Figma and pulling the screens together is a different thing. So it kind of, I would say if you're someone looking to get into service design, if you have UX skills, that's like an extra string to your bow. Like it makes you way more hireable. In the same way that if you're a front end developer and you have some UX UI skills and some understanding of that, you're kind of more hireable as a front end developer. It's a similar thing. So I have done that in the past. As I've kind of like grown like through my career, I've kind of purposely moved away from that because my interest lies more in the service and business design, actually stepping more towards the strategic space than it does in the other direction, stepping towards the, I guess, let's just generalize it as product space, like more towards UX and UI. But there's no, I would say there's, and you're probably getting this if you're listening to this, there's no real industry definition for these things. So there is no like blanket requirement for what you need to be a service designer. So if you're someone that doesn't have the UX UI skill set and actually doesn't want to work in that space, you can still shape a career in service design. You might find it a little bit harder to get in the door if you're going to blanket ignore the UX UI stuff.
Yeah. You basically touched on a bit later on in terms of like, I'll go through a sort of job description and like they do mention certain things and like you kind of nailed it already. So I'm someone who's keen on getting into service design, right? And I want that role. It sounds awesome. It sounds awesome. I love the buzzword. Well, I guess what sort of tips would you give someone in terms of someone who's really keen on getting into this role? Because you're saying it's nice to have, that UX, UI design element. But what would you say is, I guess, sort of advice in terms of getting into it? Because I know from a UX, UI design perspective, having a portfolio is awesome because that you can showcase your work. But it doesn't seem so much for service design in terms of showcasing work. Or what would you say in terms of tips wise?
It's a really good question. Like I've in the last year or so of my career, I've been like exposed a lot more to the hiring. So I've been hiring personally myself a lot more. So I'm kind of asking myself these questions a lot as I meet people, right? If I'm going to be really general before I talk about kind of specific stuff, I would say like the most important part of being a service designer mindset wise is like curiosity. Like if you're not curious and you're not willing to almost learn and go after everything you don't understand, I think you might struggle. Because like we kind of touched on, the biggest part of the role is that ambiguity, taking way too much information for one person to handle and trying to figure out how to make that valuable, right? How to distill that down into something that really makes an impact to a user or a business. So like mindset wise, curiosity is super important, and any way you can demonstrate curiosity is going to give you an edge when you're trying to apply for a job. And I know that sounds vague, but like I'll give you a really simple example. I won't name anyone, but I had someone who applied and for our grad scheme, and on his CV he'd been part of a non-for-profit, like an agency that was supporting Australia's like space travel effort, right? Nothing to do with design, nothing to do with his background. But he did that in his free time on weekends. And we probably spent a third of the interview talking about that and how he supports that. And that was an amazing way for him to demonstrate curiosity, right? And maybe I'm biasing how I hire here, but I think that's really important. The other thing I'd say is like problem solving. There's loads of different ways you can demonstrate problem solving through your background, through your uni, through whatever that might be. But again, one of the biggest things a service designer does, if I'm really making it simple, is problem solve, right? We want to achieve this user experience, but our technology doesn't let us and our business won't listen to us, right? That is really common, Ben. How many times have we been in that situation? So you have to figure out, how can we get this user experience? How do we bring the technology with us, or how do we change the technology? And then when we know these things, how do we convince the business and get the money, right? All these kind of things. So problem solving is super important. Any way you can demonstrate your ability to problem solve is amazing. The third element I would also say is like, I'm going to generalize it as kind of teamwork and empathy. As a designer generally, not just a service designer, like empathy is super important. You are spending so much of your time building relationships in very short periods of time, right? You might meet someone for an hour and that's the only time you're ever going to meet them, and you need something from them. Being able to build a rapport super quickly, kind of connect with them on a basic level and get them to be honest and open is like a critical skill, and that's a soft skill, and there's no real way to kind of prove that easily, but if you're thinking about going into this path, I'd totally think about how you can demonstrate that. And as a service designer, you really need other people. Like when I go onto a project, I really need Ben. I don't have Ben's skills, right? You need to be able to bring people with you. Typically, you're leading the method for how you're tackling a problem, but there's no way I can do every element that I need to be successful. So I have to be able to bring people with me. And so being able to show that you can collaborate and stuff is really important. Last thing would be a couple of tangible ways you can demonstrate this. I personally think a portfolio is still really important for a service designer. You don't have to think about it in the same way as a UX and UI designer would, where they're trying to make it look outstanding and show off all the visuals of the design. But if you have a body of work, or even a small body of work where you can show your design process and how you took something from A to B, that's what people will look at. It's like, what was your method? What was the impact you made? How did you deliver value in that space you were in? And if you can show them that I started at A and I got everyone to B, you've got a couple of examples of that. I personally would look at that and go, awesome, I can hire this guy or girl, right?
You're pretty spot on in the first two, right? Like the amount of times we've been through it, right? Like if you're not curious enough, like even just interviewing someone, right? Like the questions just die there. Like you don't dive deep enough to understand what the actual problem is, right? So you're just listening to them and go, okay, cool. And then you're just moving on from there and not actually figuring it out. Then goes to the part where it goes, once you find out that problem, well, how determined are you to actually try to solve it, right? Like come up with a solution for it. You can prove that through that 1 hour interaction that you have with the interviewer anyways, right? Like in terms of your soft skills. So if you're able to connect with them, and as you said, you spent 1/3 of the whole interview talking about his non-for-profit example, right? And what he's been doing. Like just even being able to demonstrate that and being able to connect on that level already just demonstrates a bit of the soft skills that he already has or even developed. Leading on from there, because if I do really want to get into service design, I guess there may be some sort of misconceptions with the term service design, because everyone knows it's a buzzword. It may be awesome to get into, but would you say there's anything that's assigned to service design in a negative way or in a different way that people might go, I'm getting into service design because they think it's UI design or something like that, or like they have a wrong sort of interpretation of what service design is? Is there anything that's out there that's misinterpreted by people that you could probably clarify for them?
There is, like, I think it's true to say there's a lot of like gray space when it comes to defining design roles, and I think people get completely fairly, I think they get confused between the distinction between those roles. Maybe like another bit of context to add is like there's a lot of existing people in the workplace whose jobs have become less significant over the last 10 years, and they're trying to find their way into like relevancy, like to try and stay relevant.
Yeah,
which is, again, totally fair, right? So again, this is maybe a too general an answer, but if I give it a simple one, like if you think about kind of business analysts, when it came to like IT, you'd have a business analyst on every IT project back in the day, right? And actually quite often in the big companies, you still have that. But what a business analyst does, a lot of that has been eroded away by what certain designers can provide. So a lot of companies anyway, as they try and pivot towards these new ways of working and new methods and new priorities, those kind of roles are sort of slowly disappearing, and they're slowly morphing into kind of design roles and that sort of stuff, right? Again, general, but you kind of get the point. And I think what that leads to is a lot of people who then try to reclassify themselves as a designer, right? So you get a lot of people who go, I'm a service designer now, you know, kudos to them. Some people do make that transition really smoothly and do a great job. But also some people do that and don't really understand what role they're kind of getting themselves into, and there are kind of impacts down the line. So yeah, I would just say like you kind of have to be clear about the path you're heading on in your own mind and understand what space you want to play in. Because I think if you understand what space you want to play in, what you do and don't do, and what your value is, you kind of won't come into any problems like that. You can kind of forge your own path, because there is a lot of ambiguity in the design space, right? And or I guess the positive side to that is you can shape your own path. There's enough space for everyone to kind of make their own way and decide who they are on that continuum. So yeah, I kind of went on a tangent. I hope that answers the question, but yeah.
Yeah, it kind of does, in the sense that if I was a business analyst, right, and I want to get into service design, like that's only really one aspect of what service design really is. And people may misinterpret it as, or they're kind of one in the same, but actually there's a lot more that goes into service design that you really have to think about, like analyzing data, analyzing information. Sure, that's one thing, but like you mentioned, right, like the connection between people, process, and technology is a whole different realm, right? It's no longer like business analyst anymore. You really need to understand certain technologies as well, and you really need to have that people and soft skills, right? So being able to problem solve, being able to interview people, being able to dive deep and have that curious mindset is a bit different to what a business analyst does, which
it's hard to answer it generally, but to use that example, a BA would make a really successful transition to a service designer, because you know 2/3 of the skill set when it comes to problem solving, analysis, all that sort of stuff, you'd have those things. What you wouldn't have typically is the like more deep understanding of customer and user experience, the design method, enterprise design thinking, all these kind of like methods. Again, that's a whole nother podcast or video probably. You could learn that pretty easily, right? With enough time, effort, and dedication, and again, curiosity, right? You could learn that, and you could become a really good designer. The other thing I'd say is like you get a lot of designers who end up specializing on platforms, which is another really valid path. And if you're someone that is a specialist in a platform, transitioning to be a designer, that's another element of a service designer might need to learn the platform. They might not have that skill set, but if you learn the platform and you know the platform, you're then trying to learn the service design skill set, right? So you kind of transitioning into these things is totally an option. It's just understanding what your gap is and being curious enough and driven enough to fill the gap. I think you can transition anywhere. When I say platform, Ben, I typically mean things like Salesforce, Adobe. There's all these big platforms that suck in designers and devs at the moment.
This part's probably the more interesting thing, and you probably answered it already, so I'll try to reword it a bit differently. But I've been looking at a whole bunch of job descriptions of what a service design is, right? And every company obviously describes it very differently. I've tried to pull out the common themes around it. One of the first one has always been targeted towards your qualifications or background, right? So obviously in your case, it was very different, right? In terms of qualifications. So for a lot of them, I've been saying, and you can just say yes or no, or like really go into it. But even in the first one is like, you should, as someone who is successful for this role, you should have a sort of tertiary qualification in user experience design, service design, or anything related. Like, no. To me, that's no, right? Because you already kind of answered that.
Companies might specify that, but I'd be expecting that to be the kind of like design agencies that maybe would look for that. In short, no, I don't think that's relevant.
That's not relevant.
We don't look for that, and I know other peers that don't look for that either. So.
And then I guess the second part is maybe this was one of the misconceptions in terms of service design as seen as needing to have a lot more experience, or it's not an entry-level role, right? So in a lot of them, you're saying you need 5 years of experience in human-centered design, or like methods with focus on strategy and research. Now, 5 years seems to be quite a lot. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say entering as a service designer, imagine you're straight out of uni, or maybe you didn't go to uni and you're kind of going onto a design path. Starting as a service designer is quite hard.
Okay, so an entry level role, right?
Yeah, not just as someone trying to get into the door, but imagine you actually got into the door, through the door, and you were a service designer, and it was like your first gig. I think you'd really struggle. So I can understand why they ask for it. Typically, companies use service designers as de facto leads in many ways. So they quite often look for seniority for that reason, more than the skill set themselves, if that makes sense. Like typically you're sort of on your own, or you're sort of leading a team, that's more why they would be asking for the years, if I'm reading between the lines. But I think if you're looking for a route into service design, any way you can get into customer experience, user experience, digital strategy roles, any of those kind of entry points are super relevant, right? If you maybe you can get a customer experience analyst role, or maybe you can get a junior UX role, or maybe you can get a junior strategist role, or there's going to be different pathways. But yeah, there aren't many entry-level service design roles, to answer your question, I suppose.
Right. So so I guess the number 5 is actually just like, just a number there, but like in actual fact, service designer is more of a bit more of a senior role, right? Like if we're talking about in terms of levels, right? Like a business analyst, but like a senior business analyst or someone would have a bit more experience to be more successful, I guess, because you'd be thrown into the deep end, right? Like, and maybe as someone as an entry level person wouldn't want to be completely left alone yet.
Yeah, I'm generalizing because, I hired a service design grad like 3 months ago, right? So they do exist. I'm also more biased by the consulting route. As a consultant, you do get chucked into the inferno, right?
Yeah.
But I think if you were trying to apply for think of companies like Canva, right? Let's use a generic example. Really cool, forward-thinking product companies. They would have offerings. They would have roles for junior service designers, definitely. So you'd be able to find your way in. It's just kind of which road you're going down. But yeah.
Makes sense. And I kind of touched on this last one, but they were saying you need to be proficient in like Adobe CC, designing blueprints, customer journey maps, and all that. communication materials. I guess we'll split into two. Do you need to know certain design software? And then the other part is, do you, like, we really kind of touched on it, but designing blueprints, right? Like, yeah, you do kind of need to know how to design blueprints in a way, right? Or I have a general idea of it. What are your thoughts on those two? Having the software design skills.
I'd say it's not essential, but great if you do. And it doesn't need to be the Adobe suite. Sorry, crime going on. Yeah, it's not essential. Do you remember, like, I don't know, back in the day, like when you were applying for uni and stuff, right? On your CV, it was like really important to say that you were like proficient with Microsoft Excel and all these sorts of, yeah, do you remember all that? I'd say it's kind of a similar thing. If you can have a section of your portfolio or CV that says, I can use these softwares, people glance at it and go, awesome. I don't think it matters what softwares they are. Like if I think about our designers, if I think about our UI designers, right? We have people that really love and use Figma. We have people that swear by Sketch. We have people that swear by the Adobe suite, right?
Yeah.
I think if you can use them, or at least if you're proficient in them, maybe you don't spend your whole day in it, but if you can open a file and make some edits and not destroy the file, that's a good thing.
I think probably bias on my perspective, because as I've spoken to Vish as well already, but when you're already proficient in sort of one software, I think I guess what they're looking for is that a lot of the design softwares are quite similar in a way. So you're having that transferable skill, like you said, as long as you open it up and know what's happening and you don't destroy it, right? Like being able to understand those design elements and stuff that's going on is probably, I guess, what they're looking for. But you don't have to. Like it's not like a must-have. It's just very nice to have if you do.
I mean, blueprinting. Because sorry, you asked specifically about blueprinting as well. That's like I guess I would call that like a tool in a service designer's toolkit. For anyone that isn't familiar what a blueprint is, that's probably a whole topic as well. But just think of it as an asset that tries to combine like a customer journey with the process, with the technology and what's happening in the back end. Like really broadly, it kind of shows you everything that's going on. You do need like a decent design eye. And if it's for no other reason than clients or the company you're working for will expect the stuff you produce to look passable, right? So you do need to be able to create stuff to a degree that looks okay, but I wouldn't worry too much. Like Ben and I create all these assets quite often in things like Mural or Miro, right? Which are kind of digital whiteboards, and we sometimes translate them to more polished assets. But I think my short answer is these are all really nice to haves, but it's not essential. Yeah.
One last question. When it comes to everyone wants to future-proof themselves, right? Like, I want to make sure I get into a role that's going to be in the future, like with the metaverse, NFT, and all this stuff, and like developers being the thing nowadays, right? Like, because back then, if you ask, what profession would you want to get into? No one would have said design, right? Like everyone would be like, yeah, go become a doctor, an engineer, and all these things, right? Because it's secure, safe roles, right? Because it will be relevant. It will stay for the next however many years. So I guess the controversial question, which I asked is, and if you can provide an unbiased view as much as possible, do you honestly believe that the role of a service designer will still be here in 5 to 10 years time? Because I guess that does in a way influence people's choices in terms of whether they wanted to take on that role. Thoughts on that?
It's interesting, right? Like, maybe the way I'd answer that is, so I would say technology more so than ever is changing the world and the corporate world and jobs. And if you're someone that can put yourself in the middle of technology, people, and business, whether they call it service design or not, who knows, but you're always going to be relevant, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is use a technology, it doesn't matter what technology that is, to solve a problem for a person. And it doesn't matter whether that's using enterprise design thinking, right? Maybe some cool new method comes along that becomes relevant that you learn, but you're using a method to solve a problem using a technology. And to me, that feels like a very human skill. So do I think that job can get automated? Maybe in some really micro cases and some micro problems, but not really when you come to the complex kind of enterprise level, or to like brand new innovative ideas to market. So I think these skills you would have as a service designer will always be relevant. You might need to change how you use them and what you use them for in 10 years, but I'd be really surprised if you became completely useless.
It was pretty much spot on with what Vish was saying, right? Like if AI can suddenly automate his job, or like completely take over his job, then fair enough. But you mentioned like the title, right? Like being a service designer might change. That title might change, but it just seems like what you're doing, right, kind of aligns with the role. It's human-centered design, right? It's about humans, right? And it's about how we interact. And it's going to be very, unless it's computers or like technology is able to predict what humans can do. Like that's insane, right? Like, so being able to interact and communicate, I think that's something that won't ever go away, especially as a service designer, right? Like those core skills.
10 years anyway.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Or I'll have another one of these in 5 to 10 years time and see if your opinion changes.
Yeah, when I'm like in the unemployment queue or something.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Don't we leave this last few minutes if there's anything that you want to talk about in terms of service design, right? So if there's anyone that, last words, I guess, when you want to get out there in terms of if someone is interested in getting into service design or what service design is about, or I guess, yeah, just general things about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from a personal level, I didn't know I wanted to be a service designer until I became one. I think it's a really, really interesting career path. And if you're someone that loves challenges, right? If you're someone that loves like new problems and coming up with ways to solve those problems in unique ways, I think you'd really love the role. So from that side, I'd say like it's a really cool path to pursue. And the other thing I'd say is like there's actually loads of really good resources online around not just service design but the design space in general. You know, there's top of head, there's things like Udemy, and there's all those kind of like sites which do really good entry level content behind what these things are. So if you're curious and it's something you want to look at, for example, design thinking, it has been a thing for 5 to 10 years and probably will still be a thing for a while, right? There's loads of these like frameworks and methods that service designers use, and you can learn about them for free. And I would say definitely do that. There's loads of really good resources. So it's something that you can kind of fill some of the gaps yourself if you're looking to get into it really easily. And showing that kind of like initiative is something that makes you quite hireable as well. Like connecting it back to my like curiosity point. Yeah, and I'm biased, but I think it's a cool job. I like my job. Like, I don't know. Ben, what do you think? Like, you've seen me work.
Yeah, you seem to love it.
Okay.
I definitely think like, yeah, what you're saying. So anyone who's going to be interviewed by Joe, there's the points right there. You want to tick off those? You want to tick off that curiosity thing? Make sure you go check out those online courses, right? I think like almost everything is readily available, right? And it's almost free these days if you want to learn anything, right? So yeah, you demonstrate your learning ability right there by just diving deep into it.
And you know what? The last thing I would say is like, don't be afraid to tell people what you don't know. I think that's where people sometimes make a mistake. Like if you don't know something, don't be afraid to say, no, I don't, let me go look at that. Or let me go fill that gap. People quite often make that mistake. Because service design can be so broad in terms of what you're expected to know or do. That's probably true for any job, but yeah, actually this is true for all jobs, I guess. But yeah, be honest with what you do and don't know, and be upfront about how you're going to address it, and you'll be fine.
Awesome. I think that's a wrap there. But look, if anyone has any other questions, make sure you put in the comment section below. Make sure you like this video, and again, subscribe. If there's going to be heaps more videos coming out in terms of different roles, so any feedback is much appreciated in terms of what roles you guys are more interested in. Thank you so much for your time, Joe. Well, we're going to be working together anyway, so I'll be seeing you real soon. Awesome.
Cheers, man.
Nice. See ya.